we go. So last Sunday you were all here for Easter, or most of you were here for Easter, and we celebrated Jesus rising from the dead and how that message continues to be lived out and spread around the world. And it's hard to leave church on Easter morning and not feel some sense of joy and some sense of faith. I leave Easter services a bit like Christmas services on a sort of spiritual high. I feel surrounded by witnesses to God's love, and this time of year I feel particularly close to God. Lent is over and joy has filled the church. So we come back to church this week and we expect the hard stuff to be over. We expect an easier story or a celebration. Is that right? Except that's not really what we get, is it? We get the story of someone who struggles to believe what has happened. And to be honest, I think that might have been any one of us here today. I know I've had doubts over the years. It's a human thing. And I'm sure each of you has had doubts at times. And not just doubts about everyday things, but doubts about faith-related matters. Now, some people worry about having doubts, or at least showing that they have doubts, admitting that they have doubts. But doubts are part of life, even the Christian life. We should expect them to arise. One day, Martin Luther was asked the question, why do we more readily believe in Satan when he terrifies us than Jesus when he consoles us? And I think it's because we are better equipped to doubt than to hope. Because hope comes from the Spirit of God, but despair and doubt comes from our own spirit. And as humans, we should expect doubts to arise in our life. However, what I'd encourage you to do is not to ignore them. If we leave our doubts alone, try and pretend they're not there, they get the better of us. And today's gospel reading highlights something that is very helpful and important for each of us when doubts arise. Today's gospel reading is where the term doubting Thomas comes from. I'm sure you've all heard it. It's a particularly common phrase, regardless of whether people believe in Jesus or not, whether they believe in God or not. People will say, oh, you're a doubting Thomas, if you don't believe something. But I think Thomas is unfairly treated. Because actually, he's one person who showed a heck of a lot of faith. If we turn to John 11, verses 14 to 16, we hear the following about Thomas. So if you turn, that's on page, let me find it, because I haven't marked this in my Bible, but I should have done. Sorry? 1077. Thank you, Sarah. On page 1077, beginning at verse 12, it says, verse 14. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, this is the same Thomas chap, also known as Didymus. Wouldn't it be great to have two names? You could have one name in one context and one name in another, and you could go and pretend you're somebody else at times. It'd be brilliant, wouldn't it? Anyway, but Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of his disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Thomas seemed a fairly normal chap. He was committed to being part of the team. And Thomas was not the only disciple who doubted. I want you to turn now to another event that takes place after the resurrection. And that's in Matthew 28. Verse 16, which can be found on page 1000. That's a good number, isn't it? And it says, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted." Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." And I want you to hold on to the last part of that last verse. "And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." But the other thing out of that passage I want you to note is that even though they worshipped Jesus, as we do on a Sunday and other times of the week, even though they worshipped Jesus, some of the disciples still had doubts. Some of the disciples, even though they doubted, though, continued to worship. And there's no doubt that Thomas had doubts. He was not in the room with the other disciples, so he wasn't there when Jesus first turned up. And he was not prepared to believe unless he saw. He wanted evidence. He wanted to see for himself, to make absolutely certain that Jesus was alive. But the fact is, some of the other disciples had doubts also. Remember, they were in a locked room. They were scared. They were petrified. They had no idea what was going on. They thought that people would be after them to kill them because they'd been friends of Jesus. And now Jesus' enemies had got rid of Jesus. And they would be scared that they were all going to come after them as his disciples. I mean, we heard about Simon Peter, didn't we? Simon Peter at the briar, or the bonfire type thing, which is why we have a bonfire at the Easter Vigil on the Holy Saturday night, Easter Eve. Around the bonfire, he denied knowing Jesus because he was scared they were going to come after him. So these disciples were not in the best of places. They thought Jesus was dead, and they were most likely to be on the wanted list for being a follower of Jesus. If you were in their sandals, because they didn't wear shoes, how would you be feeling? Do you think you'd be all calm and collected? I don't think I would be. I think I would probably be feeling my world had been turned upside down. I would have doubts. I'd be wondering what was happening. Why is Jesus' life come to an end? What has happened to him? How can he be who he says he is when he dies on a cross? But for the disciples, their doubts are calmed because Jesus appears. And that's the most important point in dealing with any doubts we have. Being in the presence of Jesus allays our doubts. We need to be in God's presence. We need to be in Jesus' presence because Jesus brings peace. I don't know if you notice, but actually, and I think we probably ought to read the reading actually. That'd be a good thing to do. So if we turn to page 1089, chapter 20, beginning at verse 19, it says, "On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, 'Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you.' And with that, he breathed on them and said, 'Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven.' Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, remember that from Matthew's Gospel? Thomas, also known as Didymus. Sorry, earlier in John's Gospel, John 11, not Matthew. So the other disciples, one of the 12 was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' And he said to them, Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger in where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I'm not going to believe. A week later, the disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Through the doors that were locked, though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." 3 times in that reading, Jesus says, "Peace be with you." Doubts can lead to feelings of uneasiness. Doubts can lead to feeling disturbed. Doubts can also lead us to retreat into ourselves and not interact with Jesus and other Christians. Doubts can cause us to stop going to church. And this was partly Thomas's problem in today's reading. It wasn't that he doubted, it was how he reacted to his doubts. It was that he didn't remain with the group of disciples, and away from the group he was in a vulnerable position. Away from other disciples, he also missed out on the initial blessings and peace that Jesus brought during this difficult time. You see, if you go away from Jesus, if you try and pretend he's not there, or forget he's there, you're on your own. If you move away from the fellowship of God, the church, the people that you worship with on a regular basis, you put yourself in a vulnerable position. We need to take advantage of his presence. When you're experiencing difficult times or having doubts about something, you need to tap into Jesus' presence. You need to talk to other Christians about it. You need to open up your Bible and read it. You need to pray. You need to make sure you don't miss church. Because they're all helpful tools for each of us to keep us in faith, to keep us in our faith, strong in our faith. It's crucial that when we rely on Jesus' strength to guide us through the forest of doubts, it's crucial that we rely on Jesus' strength to guide us through the forest of doubts. If we turn to Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5, although it's only a quick one, so I wouldn't bother. Trust in the Lord, it says, with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. You see, when we're not connecting with Jesus' presence, we are relying on our own understanding. When we connect with Jesus, we're relying on his understanding, and we are trusting in him. Being connected to Jesus through times of doubt may not get rid of the things causing doubts, but it will bring peace. One of the things I love doing is reading and hearing stories about saints of the past. Christian people. I don't just mean the ones that get their names mentioned in the lectionary. You know, the list of readings and what Sunday is what Sunday. I mean ordinary, everyday Christians who put their trust in Jesus and hold on to it. There's a common thread that comes through with many Christian people, many Christian saints, because all those who believe and trust in Jesus are saints. Those who have experienced tough times and had doubts and walked through it. And that is that they hold on. They stay close to Jesus. They stay connected to the fellowship of the church. They stay close to the other people who share their faith. And that's what the poem Footsteps reminds us of. Remember the story? Well, the poem. There's a person walking across through life on sand, right, leaving footsteps with Jesus by the side. They're talking to Jesus. But when they look back over their life, they see there's big gaps where there's only one set of footsteps, and turn to Jesus and say, well, where were you at those times? And Jesus says, I was carrying you. They were the difficult times, but I was carrying you. I was with you. And Christian friends, those we share fellowship with in the church, are those who carry us during the difficult times. I know I wouldn't have got through periods of my life without fellow Christians supporting me, walking alongside me and encouraging me. We need to stay in the fellowship. There's a story that I want to just share. I don't know if I can remember it because I wasn't planning on saying this. But a gentleman stopped coming to church, and the vicar realised this and went to see him at his home. And when he arrived at the house, the gentleman sat in front of a red-hot, burning coal fire, just really warm. I mean, the room must have been lovely and warm. Could have been winter. He didn't say, the vicar didn't say anything to this gentleman, just sat down with him and sat in silence, and then got up and took the tongs and took out a red-hot coal out of the fire and put it on the hearth. Well, when he took it out, it was glowing red. He put it on the hearth, and very soon after he put it on the hearth, the coal had lost its red hotness. It was red. It turned black or grey, but the vicar still said nothing. And then he got up again, took the tongs, because I think it would still be hot, and picked it up, put it back in the fire, and within minutes, if not seconds, it was red, glowing red hot again. And then the vicar got up and left. But that man knew what that vicar was saying. He was saying that outside the fellowship of the church, we lose our passion, our commitment, our trust in God. We need to remain in fellowship with others. We need to stay in the church to continue holding on to our faith. Anyway, better get back to what I was supposed to be saying. Anyway, even when things that are causing doubt exist, their power is reduced if we're with others. They're still going to be there, our doubts are still going to be there, but their power to overcome us are reduced. And that's why it's so essential to keep engaging with God, keep listening to him, keep praying, keep reading the Bible, keep spending time with fellow Christians. And I think the last verses of today's reading highlight this. I didn't read these out before, so I'm going to read them now. Verse 30, which can be found on page 1090. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You see, everything that's written in the Bible is for our benefit. It's to strengthen our faith so that we can have the new life that Jesus offers. Even some of the strange parts that we can't understand have an importance. And you never know, one day it may speak to you. Keep asking yourself every time you read the Bible, how is this showing me that Jesus is my Lord and Saviour? Its primary objective, the Bible, is to help us see and believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And the second thing that is important from today's Gospel reading is how God responds when we have doubts. We shouldn't be worried about interacting with God because God is always willing to listen to our questions and help us work through them. He's very patient. He doesn't get frustrated with us. He wants to help us. He wants to make himself real to us all the time. Look at how he approaches Thomas. He comes to Thomas and says, "Peace be with you." And then he answers Thomas's questions. He makes it possible for Thomas to believe. Thomas had said, well, unless I stick my finger in his hands, where the nails were, and put my hand in his side, I will not believe. So what does Jesus do? He says, come on then, put your fingers in my hands and your hand in my side. But Thomas didn't even need to go that far, did he? He didn't need to go to put in his hand in his side, just his fingers in his hands. And that was enough for Thomas to say, "My Lord and my God." When I was a youth and community evangelist down in Birmingham before I was ordained, I worked at a church that was called St. Thomas's. It was a huge church on this outer city estate, and rather like Coventry Cathedral, it was the same kind of design. In fact, I'm not so sure whether it was the same architect. Anyway, much smaller than Coventry Cathedral. But anyway, behind the communion table, there was a huge painting on the wall. I know at Coventry Cathedral it's a tapestry, but at this church it was a painting on the wall, a big painting. And I can remember it was green, well, the background was green, and it was a picture of Thomas stood there with his arms open wide, and the words below saying, "My Lord and my God." A reminder that actually, when we're with Jesus, when we're in fellowship with others, that's how we know who Jesus is. He shows up and proves to Thomas and to us that he is resurrected, that he has defeated death. And at the same time, he highlights to us and to me that seeing him isn't the most important thing in life. It doesn't make Thomas special. Rather, those who are special are those who have not seen and believed. And this is the crux of being a Christian. Because none of us have actually met Jesus physically. We can't. We're 2,000 years on. Not 2,000 years older, I'm not saying that. We're 2,000 years on from when Jesus lived on earth as a human being. We might meet Jesus in our prayers, we might meet him in our worship, we might meet him in silence, whatever. But none of us have met the physical Jesus. Yet, we believe. And believing in God is not a scientific adventure, but ultimately it's an adventure based on faith, based on the accounts of others. Jesus doesn't want our doubts to stop us from being his disciples. Did you notice what happened in the Matthew reading just after it was indicated that the disciples had doubts? It says in verse 18, "Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations.'" Even with doubt, Jesus still gives us the privilege of being his disciples. Those original disciples, he gave responsibility to witness to others, to tell others about Jesus. The responsibility of making disciples. And there's two reasons for this. As disciples, what we do does not depend on our power, but on God's. And there is a good reason for this. As disciples of Jesus, we are continual learners. We never stop learning. Jesus is always helping us. And at times it appears that before you can do anything, you need to do a course and have a certificate. But that's not true. God operates differently. The way God teaches us is by getting us involved with the ministry of the church from the very first day we become a Christian. The very first day we believe and put our trust in Jesus. That very first day when we say, "My Lord and my God," as we suddenly dawns on us who he is. From that very first day, we are on a learning pathway with Jesus. We are involved in ministry and mission. And that is what we're tasked to do. That's what Jesus calls us to do, to just simply follow him and do what he does. So let's just be quiet for a moment. And then I'm going to pray.